Hey everyone, thank you again for joining us for another episode of the Crypto Roundtable series. Today we have a really special guest. I'm joined by my colleague Ryan Gorman, but we also have one of the founders of IOTA, Dom, alongside Dan Simerman, one of his colleagues, and this is going to be a really fabulous episode because we're going to dive a little bit in depth to exactly the understanding of IOTA, what their core mission is, what they're trying to solve, and some of the really big accomplishments that they've had over the last 6 to 12 months, both with brand awareness as well as some approvals that'll hopefully facilitate a further expansion of their protocol. So Dom, Dan, thank you for joining us. Really happy you could be here.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I just want to start off because, there's some really great projects out there, floating around, some ones that have been around for a while, and not everybody understands all the details of each one. I think IOTA is fascinating. I think what its solution-based capabilities are really useful, have a real world use to them. But I was wondering if you could kind of start off in introducing us to it and kind of delving into how it came about and where you guys see yourselves going in the future.
Yeah, of course. So maybe also some background on where we are coming from, right? Because the people, the founders behind IOTA have been in the space since 2011, 2012. So we were deeply involved in the scene, in the Bitcoin talk forums and so on. And early on, we obviously realized that blockchain and DLT, they have so much potential. And we essentially saw this Cambrian explosion of innovation, right? Everybody was like, hey, we want to tweak the ledger to basically have more supply, to have a different consensus, to have different participation incentives, and so on and so forth. And essentially was people creating solutions for a problem that might not even exist. And in 2015, we realized that there's a really big problem. And that big problem is, first of all, security, because there was a lot of hacks happening. There was a lot of privacy thefts, identity thefts happening. And distributed ledgers could obviously be a trust layer for that. And the second big problem that we saw is that through distributed ledgers, we essentially enable new forms of value exchange. What made the internet so great is this frictionless exchange of information. Now with distributed ledgers, we have this frictionless exchange of value. And that has so much potential for the future. And because we were deeply involved in IoT and obviously in DLT, we basically saw this convergence where IoT and distributed ledgers combined make a ton of sense, right? Because blockchain and DLT need the hardware component for acceleration of the algorithms and also for hardware security. That's why everybody's running around with the ledger. That's why we have MPC architectures for custody solutions and so on. And IoT really needs distributed ledgers because what we have in IoT today is this fundamental trust problem. We have these centralized architectures that are built on the cloud, and the cloud gives the device the smartness, but the cloud is also the single point of failure. And as such, we need to make sure that this trust is actually distributed and the intelligence comes out of the IoT network itself. And that is why we started IOTA, basically because we realized that we need to have a distributed ledger that is specifically built for this vision of the Internet of Things.
How far back does the idea go? How many years?
2015. So IOTA was founded 2015. So we are definitely one of the first projects, one of the early projects. And we were also the first ones that really said, hey, we need to go beyond blockchain if we really want to focus on this fundamental value creation. Because back then we also already realized that blockchains are inherently limited in terms of their scalability, in terms of their dependency on miners, in terms of their transaction fees. And none of these are really intriguing properties if you want to build your business on top of these ledgers. And as such, we went on this quest to sort of reinvent a distributed ledger with this new architecture, which we call the Tangle. And ever since, we've been working on improving this technology and getting rid of some of the bottlenecks, because at the end of the day, every technology in this space has some sort of trade-off, has some sort of bottlenecks. But what we need to focus on is basically crossing this chasm and making sure that our technologies are production ready. But if I were to summarize, IOTA very briefly is like we are fundamentally focused on value creation. We are a solution to a very concrete problem and problem set. And we really see ourselves as this digital infrastructure layer that will be ubiquitous, that will empower this machine economy, and that will also lead us into a new future of automation.
That's great. Thanks for that. You talk about this grand vision that you have for a few of these different use cases. Can you tell us about some of the projects that you've been working on specifically within the IOTA framework over the past 6 to 12 months?
Yeah. So when it comes to the IOTA use cases today, there are essentially two fundamentally very important use cases that we enable. One is data security and data integrity. Stemming from that, you have digital identity. So right now we are doing a lot of work on distributed identities that are powered by IOTA, and we're working with several corporates actually on looking at how this could be utilized for machines, but also for their corporate environment. And we're doing that under the Tangle EE working group, so we can talk more about that later, probably. And also coming from data is obviously data streams. So we are very much focused on data monetization, like how can our technology be utilized to allow you to set up a weather station and sell this data? Or more importantly, how can one company sell its data assets to another company easily and also frictionlessly? And so there are several companies that we've worked with over the years where it's about having these data streams and also having these audit trails, essentially. One exciting announcement that we've had recently was with Trademark East Africa. So there we worked with them on supply chain transparency. And that is really at the start of the supply chain. Like how can we provide transparency from the goods that come from the farmer to the distribution facilities or to the production facilities? And how can we really make this entire value chain then completely transparent?
And Africa's been really a canvas for use cases such as what you just brought up, right? So yeah, they have a lot of supply chain across different verticals and industries, and so it's a really great test bed.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really about empowering people in Kenya. Like in Kenya, for example, we hired 4 developers and trained them on IOTA, and they've been a really great asset locally working with us on this project. And now we intend to really go further with this test bed and really see how we can think about rollouts and how we can get even more partners on board. Because maybe just going back a little bit, what makes distributed ledgers so exciting? It's when they're permissionless. Because what made the internet so exciting is this permissionless nature that anybody could participate and anybody could benefit from this technology. And the same is true with blockchain and with distributed ledgers, where it's about creating this new ecosystem where everybody can join, where everybody can innovate. And we as creators of this new technology do not even know what is completely possible. And that is why we are very excited about projects like the ones with Trademark East Africa, because not only are we showing a very nice use case for our technology, but it's also about incentivizing and educating people locally and how they can benefit from our technology, how they can maybe even do a startup out of IOTA. So that's very exciting.
And I think on that point to adoption too, I think that's what's making our technology so interesting for people, is that we have a very different model, right? We are a nonprofit. We're not trying to, we're not issuing licenses to use the Tangle technology. In fact, it's even feeless. So we can kind of talk about the implications of that and why that's been so important for our, for like usability. But like when a lot of our competitors come up and they say, you know, we've got this solution, but you're going to have to pay a monthly fee for it, or you're going to have to pay a transaction fee. We actually think that curtails and really limits the possibility and opportunity of, as Dominik said, like having an open network that anyone can use, really this kind of open and free internet. And it kind of, if you've ever read like The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, it kind of overlays onto like what happens when you have kind of the internet and data as a public utility rather than owned by 2 or 3 companies. So I think when like companies like, or organizations like Trade East Africa see that, they really get excited because they see this other way to kind of engage in digital ecosystem development.
So let's talk about something that's in practice right now, because that's a great segue into the Jaguar Land Rover operations going on with the use of IOTA. I mean, that wasn't you selling them.
No, exactly. So essentially, Jaguar Land Rover developed this smart wallet for the car, allowing the vehicle to pay the infrastructure autonomously, but also allowing the vehicle to actually earn money by selling data. to the government, for example, saying like, hey, here's a pothole, please fix it. And there's some very interesting use cases which we're really looking at is like, how can we really create these smart communities where, for example, the vehicle now actually gets paid by the grid because it's selling electricity that it charged, right? So you actually create this economy because the vehicle was charging overnight, and as such, it got a much cheaper electricity price, and now I can actually sell it back to the grid just to help it with the load balancing. So those are some things that are very interesting that we're looking at. So with Jaguar Land Rover, right now, we are very much focused on getting a test bed set up. And that is kind of the general theme for us this year on how we can actually go not just from initial proof of concept or minimum viable product, but actually go to these minimum viable ecosystems where we can really test this technology together with other partners and the use case and the business model behind it, and then really go towards a product launch. Obviously, I kind of mentioned what the timeframes look like because Corona kind of screwed with a few plans here and there. Mm-hmm. But generally this year with all of the corporate partners that we are working with is we are really focused on going towards test beds and towards actual products. The same was with Dell Technologies, where we also worked on this data confidence fabric. And that's also going to be part of the Linux Foundation. And there's many more use cases that we also exploring, for example, with ST Microelectronics, where they integrated IOTA as a sort of test kit as a sort of a software module into their test kits. So there's some exciting discussions that we're holding with them also, how we can basically embed IOTA even further into this vision of IoT.
Yeah, and I think what's really cool too is that we have Dom, did Volkswagen, not Volkswagen, Jaguar was working on it for like 6 months, right? Before we even knew.
Yeah, no, so exactly, like that's the exciting part where we no longer have to hold the hands of those people that are in the ecosystem, but essentially that they're also utilizing our libraries and that they're basically building stuff on their own. And that's sort of the vision behind these ecosystems, to be self-sufficient. And you know, like that's also what I'm kind of proud of what we've done compared to other projects, because we do not do this pay to play.
Yes, yeah.
That others are doing, like paying for adoption. I think that's just putting on fake makeup, essentially.
And it's rampant. I don't think people realize exactly how often, like you see a project and you hear like, oh, you know, they're working with it. They paid them $500,000, right? Like,
yeah.
All too often.
This sounds a lot like the adoption model that Google took with Android, right? You get the platform in place, and then through the sale of data and other I guess microtransactions, you're able to monetize it. It makes sense with like Land Rover. But can you tell us a little bit more about how you're able to enable like fee-free transactions with other partnerships and other use cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we created IOTA, that was sort of one of the main properties that we looked at, because if you think about this machine economy, we are talking about very small micropayments. And in order to facilitate those micropayments, you really need to have a distributed ledger where you no longer charge transaction fees, essentially. So our primary focus with IOTA is definitely on those micropayments and how we can enable them without any fees. And that is really the main promise of the Tangle itself. First of all, that it's obviously scalable because of this new multi-dimensional architecture. So instead of having this one-dimensional chain where it's block after block after block, we have this DAG architecture, so a directed acyclic graph. And essentially, because we no longer have miners and we have a different way to achieve consensus in this network, there's no transaction fees to pay, because every participant in the network that wants to execute a transaction also has to confirm transactions of other participants. And there's always some complex math that stands behind this in terms of how you select the transactions, in terms of the entire algorithm and so on and so forth. But that is really the main promise of IOTA and the main promise of the Tangle.
Excellent.
Well, I mean, you guys have had some pretty exciting news come out recently. And by recently, I mean just last week. But the Crypto Rating Council, you guys just went through that whole process, and there's some big players behind the council. I mean, this is nothing to definitely wince about. But this is almost like from a capital market standpoint, right? There's always two sides to every protocol, and that's both the speculation of the coin as well as the use case. So this is going to be important to IOTA from a trading aspect, from adoption by more exchanges, driving fiat value into the IOTA token. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I know you're focused on how it solves, but what are your thoughts on the capital market side and what this is going to bring to the table?
Yeah, I think a lot of where we are today also has to do with the way that we do business. We never really, like I said before, we never participate in any of these pay-to-play schemes or trying to play with the market, because we just think that is just absurd. Because we fundamentally, what we care the most about is that we have a solution that really solves a problem. And I always say making a bunch of nerds rich is not a solution for this space. And yeah, so since we founded IOTA, we always said we want to focus on industrial adoption. That's why we've really been working closely with companies, doing proof of concepts, and now really also talking about how we can create products that are built on the Tangle. And when it comes to the market side, I think now we're sort of at the crossroads, because we do have those large players that say, hey, we want to actually utilize the IOTA token, but how can we enable that? So then you really fall into this whole problem set of what about volatility? What about liquidity? How can I even buy this? How can I work with an exchange that allows me to basically buy and sell tokens constantly? And that is why a lot of our work this year has really been on the or last year, I would say, and obviously this year as well, has been on the maturation on the market side, basically getting more liquidity on the market and also getting more exchanges to work with us. Because many of the companies that we work with, they obviously need to have a reliable partner to do the trading with. And they're not going to do KYC with an exchange that is based out of Hong Kong. Right? That just raises a lot of suspicions.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened?
Pretty impressive 30-day movement right there.
Yeah, after the Corona crisis, definitely great to see some recovery there. Yeah. But again, I think what's really great about this is that we are really focused on adoption, and we want to get the IOTA token adopted because we see this very important need for machine currency, because we only believe that this vision of a machine economy can be enabled via distributed ledgers and via a cryptocurrency. Yeah. And that is why we are really focused on how we can make sure that corporates actually become accustomed to IOTA as an asset that will show up in their balance sheet even, right? And there's a lot of our thinking behind this.
And Alex, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but we have a very unique problem, or I guess a solution to the blockchain kind of cryptocurrency embedded into the economics of the system, right? So because data and value are separated, a lot of our partners don't even have to think about the token if they don't want to, right? So they can just have these data-based applications, but it means that when they want to use the token, it's a great opportunity to use it for a value transfer mechanism, right? So getting on the Crypto Ratings Council, getting some more of these regulatory approvals that you'll probably hear in the next couple of weeks is incredibly exciting. But when you look at our competitors, and this is something I always come back to, I don't really hear anyone talking about it. So, we just got this ratings approval from the Crypto Ratings Council, which gives people a little more comfort engaging with the token if they want to. Now imagine a company that has no interest in engaging with the token, but is being forced to use one of the protocols, one of the big ones, one of the small ones, and the new ones. They essentially have to use this token, right? They have to use the token for gas, for value transactions, or for transaction on the network, even if they just want to send data. And the biggest hurdle that I find is how do they manage that, right? What if the token is considered a security? How do they manage it from a legal perspective? How does their accounting team hold it? How do they store it? These are all questions that I don't think the great adopters are really kind of probing. At least that's what I find. So that's what I've always found very interesting about us, is that we don't have that. And I think that's why we see so much corporate adoption, and why we're kind of being looked at as a standard starting to. I think in the last 12 months, we've had 100 patents reference IOTA, just organically, right? So from Siemens and IBM and just players that have looked at our technology and are incorporating it into their architecture, as they're thinking about patent applications. I think that's a really interesting kind of data point.
So you talk about the regulatory approvals on the way and the patents being filed on the IOTA framework. How does that bring the industry forward, not just from a use case standpoint, I think, but also from a tradability standpoint, I guess, for the asset itself, for the token itself? What does that mean not only for IOTA, but also the broader cryptocurrency and digital asset ecosystem?
Yeah, so maybe one thing that I should mention here is that I think that at the beginning of this year, we announced the Tangle EE working group. So that's basically called Enterprise Edition, Tangle Enterprise Edition, which is under the Eclipse Foundation. And the Eclipse Foundation is one of those large open source foundations that essentially hosts code and allows companies to contribute and participate there. Mm-hmm. And we formed this with several of our corporate, we founded it with several members, like Dell Technologies, like STM, like Software AG, like universities, and so on. And essentially the thinking there is, hey, we all of us believe in the future of IOTA and believe in the future of distributed ledgers. And there's some very exciting applications, like, for example, decentralized marketplaces or decentralized identities. Why don't we all come together and talk about those problems, talk about what it actually means to integrate these technologies into our existing infrastructure today? And let's obviously also talk about the business cases that come from those new use cases and new technologies. So we really see this as a big co-creation, even though I hate the word, but it's really us coming together with the corporate partners, with the startups, but also obviously with the community on how we can resolve those big problems. And we're also part of the Digital Chamber of Commerce, where we are really thinking about the whole regulatory side about this. And we also founding members of INATBA, which was created together with the European Commission and together with 120 members, where we also focused on the legal and regulatory side around cryptocurrencies. So I think all of this is really about the industry coming together and understanding that in order for us to actually be adopted, there are certain hurdles that need to be resolved. And we are definitely one of the leading projects that is focused on resolving and removing those barriers. And at the end of the day, the incentive of everybody here is to make the pie bigger. I think all of these competitions between each other have to stop, and people should really be focused on how can we make sure that in the history books, distributed ledgers have really fundamentally solved very big problems.
Indeed, a rising tide does lift all ships, at least at this point in history. You said hurdles, and IOTA's had a handful of its own, even recently. Can you tell us a little bit about what led the mainnet to be taken down for a period of time, and how that ultimately was resolved?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially what happened was the following. We have an open source wallet that is called Trinity, and it's one of the most popular wallets with tens of thousands of downloads. And we had the third-party integration called MoonPay, which was integrated to essentially enable direct fiat to IOTA payments. And unfortunately, the third-party provider got hacked, and because of a vulnerability in the wallet, they were able to essentially steal the private keys of some of the users in the network. So in total, around $2 million worth of tokens were stolen through this scheme. We then obviously had to take this precautionary measure of taking the network offline. And I'll talk about the coordinator soon after I'm done with the story itself, and take these precautionary measures and really implement a safety plan and mitigation plan to make sure that there's not more users that are affected by this scheme. So
going forward, sorry to cut you off, but how do you guard against something like that happening going forward?
Let me maybe finish the story first. And so essentially, we had this mitigation plan. We allowed the Trinity users to safely mitigate to their new seat. And then what's very exciting is that David, my co-founder, essentially announced that he will pay back those affected users personally.
Wow.
And that was a great commitment from himself, because essentially it's $2 million.
Excellent.
And what are we doing against that? So most obvious part is that we develop software that is secure. We do not develop software that is the most adopted. It has to be the most secure, and it has to be the most adopted. So we understand that we've made some mistakes here, and our due diligence process and our internal audit reviews and so on and so forth have to be much more done thoroughly. And that is also why we've implemented a list of new safety measures into the foundation, and also making sure that we are really covered, that at every step, at every new release, and that we also, for major releases, that we include external auditors and make sure that we do everything right. I think everybody is much more security aware, obviously, and knows that we really also need to rethink about how we are developing these new software solutions. And that is why our new Trinity wallet will no longer be built primarily on JavaScript, but will have a Rust core. And we're also really thinking about hardware security, how we can integrate that from the get-go. So we are definitely thinking about how we can actually create the new wallet of IOTA that doesn't just look good, but is also the most secure wallet in the space. And so that is why we're rethinking it from scratch and really going on this new path for the wallet solution in IOTA.
That's great. It's good that you're doubling your focus on that. You know, a lot of project exchanges have had issues with that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, every project basically has to go through this phase where they have some security vulnerability, where they have some hacks, because at the end of the day, nobody writes perfect software.
Well,
it's impossible to do that.
I mean, had you guys integrated non-IOTA technology prior? I mean, is this something that you do on a regular basis that you need to monitor and surveil, or was this almost like a one-off?
It was a one-off, because essentially we really thought, hey, what will help the adoption of IOTA is, or what will really ease in the user experience for users is being able to buy tokens directly from the wallet itself. And
I think it sends a direct message that since you guys compensated back the hack itself, that this is not a money play. This is a mission play.
Yeah, absolutely. Fully agree with you. And we understand that we fucked up. We made a mistake here, and we own this mistake. And what we can only do right now is making sure that every next step that we take is really with the most cautious mind at play, and making sure that we stay true to our path and true to our vision, because at the end of the day, we still have a lot of work to do on our path. Just maybe one thing to mention about why the network was down, because I don't think we've talked about that yet. So
it was an extended period too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One of the things that makes IOTA great is obviously this DAG architecture, but one of the main criticisms against IOTA is this centralized component, which is called the coordinator. So maybe why do we have a coordinator today? So let's think about this conceptually, like what would it mean to launch the Bitcoin network today? Right? Let's just think about launching the very first Bitcoin version where there was no ASICs, where everybody could participate. Essentially, you would really run into a problem because we have this existing infrastructure. We have those ASICs, we have those GPUs. So everybody would be racing against each other, and there would be no consensus like we have today, where we have this equilibrium between all of those mining pools. So it would really tear apart the entire system itself. And when we launched IOTA, we also realized that there is a big threat when we launch it without this safety measure, because essentially it would allow people to just issue a lot of spam transactions and to basically tweak and take down the network. Every new technology that gets formed is not ready when we have the first alpha or beta version. IOTA today is still a beta version. And that is why we made this conscious decision to have this coordinator. And the coordinator essentially issues milestones, which are checkpoints. So they basically reference valid transactions. So then the entire network, the consensus is still decentralized, because the coordinator is essentially a compass. It's guiding the network through this validation process. And it's telling the nodes in the network like, hey, here's valid transactions, please verify them. And please make sure that it's true. And this is also something that was done in Bitcoin initially, just so you know, this checkpoint system. And our big mission since the start of IOTA was to remove this coordinator and to really have a distributed ledger that is production ready. And that is really our big focus for this year. And we have some very exciting progress that is happening there.
So you mentioned that. Can you tell us a little bit more, I guess, in more detail about some of the updates you have in the pipeline as a way to, wrap up this so far great conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So since last year, we announced our essential roadmap for Coordicide. How can we remove the coordinator, and how can we have a new IOTA version, essentially, that is a complete upgrade to the current network. And we already have an alpha version of this software out, and the next very big milestone will be achieved within the next 4 weeks, where we will have a new alpha network which has a consensus implemented, which has value transfers implemented. And our goal then is that after this version is that we are really going towards an incentivized testnet, meaning that we believe that this is really a version of the future of IOTA where we are willing to put out real money bounties for participants to break the consensus, to break the software and so on. And then the plan is really to have battle test the software, make it production ready, and then launch it on the mainnet. And that is a really major milestone for us. Apart from that, what we are also focused on right now is how can we implement some of those future aspects of IOTA, those properties, into the current mainnet already. Like for example, what we are doing is we are really rethinking the protocol from the ground up, the important changes that we can make to significantly increase the performance, and also to introduce new features, like for example, reusable addresses, or like UTXO, so that we can have digitized assets running on top of IOTA. And also new signature schemes, which, for example, also enable smart contracts then. So that is really our thinking behind this. First of all, we have Corticide happening. And second of all, we are improving the current version of IOTA to really make it production ready, because our thinking behind all of this is that we want to really onboard more corporate partners, get them very comfortable that IOTA is the main technology that they can bet on and really build products with.
And you guys don't currently have smart contracts. Is that something that's in the lab right now?
Yeah, so for the last 2 years, we've been working on a project called Cubic. Mm-hmm. And the vision behind that was that it's quorum-based computation for IoT, and that we would create dedicated hardware for those devices to execute the programs. But essentially, we've diverged from that path to really focus on the software component primarily. And that is basically the smart contract version of IOTA, which will allow you to really have very scalable and low transaction costs for the execution of those programs. It has I would say it has not the completely same focus set as Ethereum, but it can enable many of the same applications, like for example, oracles, and obviously anything that has to do with automation, essentially, also including payments.
With higher transaction rates.
I'm sorry. One last thing, because this has been a great conversation. Can you tell people how they can where they can go to learn more about you guys and stuff that you're doing and stuff you're thinking about, and any way for them to kind of be involved with the foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best source right now is IOTA.org. Just so you know, we have a new website coming up within the next week or two. So that will be a lot better than what we have right now. It also has a lot more content to go through. Obviously, our blog.iota.org, where you can see most of our recent announcements and communication. And I think the best way to really engage with us is through Discord. We are really focused on transparency and openness. So a lot of our development and our research is happening on Discord itself. So you can directly interact with the team there. And we also have a YouTube channel where we upload a lot of videos to really educate people about IOTA, about the technology itself, and also about use case. So I think those three are the major sources here.
Excellent, great, thank you. This has been a great conversation. We'll definitely have to have you back again soon once we start implementing some of those upgrades and we can really talk about them in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Dom, Dan, thank you guys so much for the time. Really appreciate it. This has been hugely, this has been a great conversation. I learned a lot more about IOTA than I did when we came into this call. So
yeah, thank you.
For sure. Thanks, guys.
All right, guys. Have a great one.
Later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.